fortunate to have with us today actually several of the IPCC authors from working for conference. So in addition to myself, I've got Dr. Siri Eriksen, working with 3, Alex Wang, who is from working group 1, and Nick Simpson, who is also in working group 2 along with myself. So from across the working group of the IPCC and from 4 different continents. So we will share this presentation and take comments. And we also have the Norwegian IPCC focal point with us online, who will give a couple of comments. And then we will do the presentation and open up for comments. So we have a bit of time to discuss. Trying to switch the slide, but while that's happening, I could just say very briefly what is the synthesis report. We've had a few different reports come out. So essentially, about every 7th year, there's a cycle of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And within that cycle, several reports are produced. So you've got the 3 assessment reports, working group 1 on the physical science basis, working group 2 on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and working group 3 on mitigation. And then you've got special reports. So we've also got 3 special reports as part of this cycle, and you can see on the right on land, ocean and cryosphere, and 1.5 degrees warming. So the synthesis report, what it does is it takes findings from across these 6 reports, it's the final report that comes out in this cycle, and puts them all together to see what have we learned about climate change and what do we need to do. So that's why a lot of authors and government delegates then were gathered just over a week ago ended up being a full week to go through the draft that authors had written, go through line by line, word by word, to ensure that it's clear for policymakers in different contexts. So it's always the science that counts, but we go through word for word to ensure that the messages are clear and balanced. So just to introduce some of the key messages, one of the key messages is, well, the more we delay, the fewer options we have in future. So the more we delay in terms of action, in terms of adaptation and mitigation, the fewer options we actually will have in future when it comes to both adaptation and mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and development options. A second key finding is that the choices and actions that we make now determine the prospects both for current and future generations. So we're talking long term. What we do now determines what we can do long term. A third important key message is the need for holistic actions, holistic solutions. So the term climate resilient development integrates adaptation and mitigation to advance sustainable development for all. So climate action is really placed within sustainable development and the need to shift pathways towards more higher sustainability. We also see that many adaptation and mitigation options exist already, are feasible and effective, but they vary across regions, system perspectives. So not all the choices, not all the actions are equally available to all the population. So what's required now are both deep and equitable climate actions, and they're needed urgently to advance climate resilient development and sustainable development. We're going to speak from 3 different figures. There are 7 figures in the synthesis report. We're going to speak from 3 different ones. I'll try to be not go too much depth, and then you can ask questions. But so what this figure does is it synthesizes actually from across the working groups and across the special reports as well, to illustrate how near-term choices and actions have consequences for the long term. So in the middle, we see how the development pathways shift over time. On the y-axis, we can see how the integration of emissions reductions, adaptation, and sustainable development lead to higher climate resilient development and shifts towards sustainability, higher sustainability. We see is with this red pathway, options are increasingly constrained. But it also shows that it is possible to shift. If we do so fairly soon, it is possible to shift to the more sustainable and climate resilient pathway. So this speaks to that the window of opportunity to act is actually fairly short, and we need to do that quickly, and that we need to be implementing these changes in this in this decade. A key thing here is also that we are where we are today based on historical trajectories, which has to do with past emissions, past climate change, past development. The needs have increased warming, and there are also increased development gaps. So these development gaps exist, but also determine what options exist around the world. What we also know is that climate resilient development is progressively constrained by every incremental warming, and in particular beyond 1.5 degrees. And that means that's why we've labeled that warming limited to below 1.5 degrees. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that we don't have severe effects at present and 1.1 degrees of warming. And some of these threats are actually already existential to some populations. What we see is that with increased warming here on some of these pathways, progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goal will be reduced, and prospects for climate resilient development in future is also reduced because you're here and you're not able to move onto the high pathways. One of the key findings is that current policies are insufficient. So they're insufficient when it comes to both adaptation and to mitigation. So the policies that implemented by the end of 2020 will result in higher greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 than emissions that are implied by our national determined contribution. So basically, we're not fulfilling what we promised. And this is what we call a mitigation implementation gap. And without a strengthening of policies, it's likely to have a global warming of more than 3 degrees by the end of the century. Financial flows have increased. However, there's still more financial flows going into fossil fuel than actually going into climate action. And there's much more finance going into mitigation than it is to adaptation. So there's a huge adaptation gap in terms of adapting to the adverse consequences of climate change that we're already seeing. An example of how this is undermining the SDGs is how climate change has reduced food security, affected water security, and hindered efforts to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So climate change has already caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and to people. Important here is that the impacts are unequally distributed across systems, across regions, and across sectors. We already see substantial damages. Some of them are irreversible, i.e. they will persist, in terrestrial, freshwater, cryospheric, coastal, and open ocean systems. Also see economic damages from climate change in climate-exposed sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, energy, and tourism. And individual household livelihoods are also affected through extreme events, through destruction of homes, infrastructure, loss of property, effects on human health, and food security. What we've also seen already is that hard and soft limits to adaptation are being reached, i.e. there are some effects that we cannot adapt to, we physically cannot adapt to, or that we do not have the resources or technology to adapt to them at present. And further warming, every incremental warming, and delaying action means that these impacts will intensify and that the options will actually be reduced. The challenges include the cost escalation over time, measures become more expensive, also lock into particular infrastructural investments, for example, stranded assets, and also the reduced effectiveness of options. So adaptation options, for example, become less effective with warming, such as some ecosystem-based solutions and water-based solutions, such as irrigation. Without rapid, deep, and sustained mitigation and accelerated adaptation actions, losses and damages will continue to increase, and especially projected adverse impacts in Africa, the least developed countries, the small island developing states, Central and South America, Asia, and the Arctic, and disproportionately among vulnerable populations. So with additional warming, the losses and damages will increase, especially among vulnerable populations. What we also see is with warming is that the limits to adaptation increase. So, for example, limited freshwater resources pose hard adaptation limits for small islands, and regions dependent on glacier and snow melt also meet some of these, increasingly meet some of these hard adaptation limits. There's actually a lot I could say here, but I'm going to move to the next slide. So I did say that we know that we have many options, that they exist, feasible and effective options exist. How do we actually make these changes? We do know quite a bit from across the working groups. So from mitigation to adaptation, what is it that needs to be put in place in order to enable action? Key here is that actions taken by governments with civil society and the private sector can shift development, and it's about how that interaction takes place. Inclusive governance is a common point both in mitigation and adaptation. Inclusive development choices and actions that are integrated across governance levels, from the subnational up to the international, across sectors and across time frames, so from the short term to the long term. Importantly, these enabling conditions that are listed here are also differentiated by context. So what might be, fairly easy to put in place in Norway might not necessarily be as easy to put in place in a different geographic context, such as a small island development state, or say among poorer populations somewhere else. The important point here is also that inclusive engagement processes draw diverse knowledges and values, including indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. So the place and the importance of indigenous knowledge has become particularly prominent in this report. We also know that behavior and lifestyle changes are possible and enable these shifts in development towards sustainability, but what's important here is the way that they are supported by policies, by infrastructure and technology. So effective climate action is enabled by political commitment, well-aligned multi-level governance, institutional frameworks, laws, policies, and strategies that enhance access to both technology and to finance. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Nick Simpson, who is also on working group 2, and who is also on the synthesis report, and he's at the Global Center for Climate Mobility. And Nick, you're going to say a few words about equity as a key consideration of climate change and enabler of action. Please go ahead, Nick.
Thank you, Siri, and good afternoon, everyone. So equity is a key consideration of climate action because vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to current climate change are disproportionately affected. Present development challenges causing high vulnerability are influenced by historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism, especially for many indigenous peoples and local communities. We see that vulnerability is exacerbated by inequity and marginalization linked to, for example, gender, ethnicity, low income, or combinations thereof. Climate action cannot ignore these broader megatrends in development that constrain the sustainability of implementing adaptation and mitigation together, as well as progress towards a more sustainable world. Regions and people with considerable development constraints have high vulnerability to climate hazards, and systemic barriers constrain the implementation of adaptation options in vulnerable sectors, regions, and social groups. Some key barriers include limited resources, lack of engagement, insufficient mobilization of finance, lack of political commitment, limited research, and/or slow uptake of adaptation science, and a low sense of urgency. Importantly, inequity and poverty themselves also constrain adaptation, leading to soft limits and resulting in disproportionate exposure and impacts for the most vulnerable groups. Yet we know the greatest gains in well-being, for example, in urban areas, can be achieved by prioritizing finance to reduce climate risk for low-income and marginalized communities, including people living in informal settlements. Adaptation and mitigation actions that prioritize equity, climate justice, social justice, rights-based approaches, and inclusivity lead to more sustainable outcomes. It can also reduce trade-offs, support transformative change, and advance climate-resilient development if implemented equitably across scales, sectors, and regions. But hard limits and soft limits to adaptation are being reached in some sectors and regions, while maladaptation is also increasing and disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups. Further, systemic barriers to equitable responses to climate change, such as funding, knowledge and practice gaps, including lack of climate change literacy and data, hinder adaptation progress. For example, climate-related research on Africa that represents not just the assessment of climate action, but also what we know about what we know, faces severe data constraints, as well as inequities in funding and research leadership that reduces adaptive capacity. Many countries lack regularly reporting weather stations, and data access is often limited. For example, from 1990 to 2019, research on Africa received just 3.8% of climate-related research funding globally. And 78% of that funding for Africa went to EU or North American institutions, with only 14.5% going to African institutions. This has led to an inequity in the science, and a number of climate change research publications with locally based authors are among the lowest globally. That affects leadership, research relationships, priorities, and what gets included in the big questions around climate action in marginal regions. Equity, inclusion, and just transitions at all scales enable deeper societal ambition for accelerated mitigation and climate action more broadly. Ambitious mitigation pathways imply large, but also sometimes disruptive changes in economic structure with significant distributional consequences within and between countries, including shifting income and employment during transition from high to low emissions activities. While some jobs may be lost, low emissions development can also open up opportunities to enhance skills and create jobs. Broadening equitable access to finance, technologies, and governance that facilitate mitigation and consideration of climate justice can help equitable sharing of benefits and burdens, especially for vulnerable countries and communities. Core to this transition is equity in climate finance and technology. Finance, technology, and international cooperation are critical enablers for accelerating climate action. Both adaptation and mitigation finance need to increase many-fold to address rising climate risks and accelerate investments in emissions reduction. There is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close global investment gaps, given the size of the global financial system. but there are significant barriers to redirect and align capital to climate action needs, both within and outside the global financial sector, and in the context of economic vulnerabilities and indebtedness faced by many developing countries. But climate resilient development is enabled by increased international cooperation, including improved access to such financial resources. The IPCC assesses that public finance is an important enabler of adaptation and mitigation and can also leverage private finance. Adaptation funding predominantly comes from public sources at the moment, and public mechanisms and finance can leverage the private sector by addressing real and perceived regulatory costs and market barriers, for instance, via public-private partnerships. Finally, increased finance would address many of the soft limits to adaptation and rising climate risks, while also averting some of the related losses and damages, particularly for vulnerable countries. So enhanced mobilization of and access to finance, together with building capacity, are essential for implementation of mitigation, adaptation, and progress towards climate resilient development. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I'll now hand over to Dr. Minal Pathak, who is Associate Professor at Ahmedabad University, and she is also a Senior Scientist on Working Group 3. So let me just switch the slide. Minal, are you ready to speak?
I am ready, Siri. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you well. So just start speaking and I'll sort out the slide. There we go.
Thank you so much, Siri, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, although I wish I could be there in person and see the audience. And Siri has asked me to speak to this colorful and complex figure here on the screen. But just taking forward the messages that Siri and Nick mentioned about ambitious mitigation in terms of emission reductions and adaptation, this figure gives us the message of hope. It is a synthesis of three figures in the underlying working group reports. The figure shows the solution space that as Siri mentioned, that there are multiple feasible, effective, and low-cost options that are available now in the near term. So if you will look at this figure has two panels. The top panel, panel A, lists the adaptation and mitigation options across systems, and we list these systems as energy supplies, settlements, industry and waste, land, water and food, health, and society, livelihoods and economies. Can you please stay on the previous slide, Siri? Yeah, thank you so much. So, so the figure shows that there is a significant potential for changes in these sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which you see on the right in the panel from the mitigation working group report. And on the left, you see the adaptation options and responses, which also show the feasibility of these responses in the two gray columns and the synergies with mitigation. The darker the color, the higher is the feasibility of that option. And the dots indicate the confidence in the assessment. So you can see that there are options that can address both mitigation and adaptation across these systems. And the bottom panel, which I'll come to in a bit, is about demand side option and lifestyle changes. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And we've split the figure just to go through some of these options in a little more detail. So if you look on the right, then solar and wind clearly stand out among the energy sector options. So the color gradient shows from blue to red shows the increasing cost. So blue shows the lower cost and the red shows the higher cost. And the length of the bar indicates the mitigation potential. So how much greenhouse gas, how much CO2 reduction can that option if implemented, achieve. Of course, I would like to mention that these are global numbers and they come from a range of studies. So each option would have a different potential across regions. And there are regional studies to support these facts. So we are pretty confident of this assessment. And similarly, there are energy options like diversifying the energy mix and resilient power systems, which can also deliver adaptation benefits. And if you look at the bottom panel, clearly we see the importance of ecosystems to say that conserving and protecting ecosystem can not only deliver mitigation and adaptation, but also a range of other benefits. It also shows, the report also highlights clearly that effective and equitable conservation of 30 to 50% of the Earth's land, fresh water and ocean can, of course, secure a healthy planet, safeguard nature, support people's livelihoods, provide food and water, support disaster risk reduction, and deliver health and well-being benefits. So, so there is also high confidence in this assessment from adaptation that many of these options are not very high cost and they are feasible in a range of contexts. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this one shows the potential of actions in human settlements. Urban areas and urban settlements stand out as a key system where we can implement ambitious mitigation and adaptation. And on the right, you can see that efficient buildings, efficient appliances, shifting to public transport, electric vehicles, all of these can deliver greenhouse gas emission reduction. And of course, a lot of these climate action also deliver co-benefits for air quality and human health. We don't have great options for shipping and aviation, but efficiency and demand reduction can deliver greenhouse CO2 emission reduction. And you can see the green infrastructure. So in the working group 3, we call it green and blue infrastructure. So urban forests, urban parks, green roofs, green trees, protecting urban lakes. All of these options together as an integrated solution can transform urban areas into more sustainable, livable settlements and also support climate action. And on the left, if you see the society, livelihoods and economy, you can see that supporting disaster risk management, livelihood diversification, and many of these strategies, including social safety nets, can protect populations from increasing climate impacts. And on the right, for industry, you can see that fuel switching stands out as the key industry option, but also energy and material efficiency in the industry sector can reduce emissions. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this is the final panel of the figure. I think the graphic looks a bit boring, but it delivers a very interesting message that comes from Working Group 3, which shows that demand side options and lifestyle changes can deliver substantial emission reduction and can range to up to 70% in end-use sectors such as buildings, transport, and industry. And the underlying report showed that actions such as like I said, shift to public transport, supporting sustainable healthy diets, shifting away from meat-based diets, reducing and avoiding food loss and waste, and a range of other lifestyle and behavior changes can reduce emissions, but they are anyway needed for a sustainable planet or a sustainable future, I would say. So the green arrow shows the mitigation potential for these end-use sectors. And you can see that there is a huge impact in changing diets, both from the reduced conversion of land, but also to people's health and adaptation. And the underlying report lists 60 actions, including everything from efficient buildings, set point adjustments, and just the little changes that we can make in the lifestyle. And as Nick mentioned, this report calls to status consumption, that the high-income, wealthier households probably need to lead climate action because their consumption is disproportionately high, but that at the same time, all actors have to come in. So it also talks about how choices are presented and the role of governments and private sector, as that came out in the figures Siri presented. So I'll stop here and pass it back to you, Siri, maybe.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. So it speaks to the key message that the choices and actions that are implemented this decade that she was talking about that we can actually make have impacts now and for thousands of years. I mean, just thinking about sea level rise, for example, the more warming that takes place due to the actions that we actually set in motion, due to the emissions that we actually create now, the more sea level rise, the more impacts for actually hundreds, but also thousands of years because of the inertia in sea level rise dynamics. But I'll hand over finally to Dr. Alex Ruan, who's the co-director of the Climate Impacts Group at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. So the four of us who are presenting today, actually, we worked together like 24 hours a day, just a week ago. So this is sort of a group therapy session of being together at Lisbon again. So it's wonderful to see you, Alex, and I appreciate that you've got up extremely early to join us today.
All right, thanks, Siri. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to join here, and yeah, it's been a whirlwind set of weeks here, but we're really proud of the report. And as Siri mentioned, this is the culmination of more than 8,000 pages from underlying special reports and working groups reports, and we boiled this all down to about 10 pages and about 7 figures, and that was a really long task to get it all just right. We had to deal with more than 300,000 review comments over the course of these working group reports. But what you'll see here is really our attempts to boil down these messages to the big take-home messages and synthetic results that tie together all of these different things. So I'm going to talk about figure SPM1, and this is the figure that tries to connect what we've already seen to the direction that we're going. So if you'll advance the slide here, we'll look at it piece by piece. Yeah, so the overall headline from figure 1 is that adverse impacts from human-caused climate change will continue to intensify. And this tells the story of how, really climate scientists came to this because we are seeing observed widespread and substantial impacts and related losses and damages that we can attribute to climate change. So here are icons showing all of the different major sectors and systems of the world, both human systems and natural systems, where we have observed and attributed these particular changes to the climate change signal itself. So you can see there are things like physical water availability, where we are seeing mixed impacts because the water cycle is so regional. But for almost all of the other ones, there is a net balance on the global level of adverse impacts. And we have confidence in these impacts affecting things like food, human health, our cities, our settlements, our infrastructure. And we see all kinds of changes in biodiversity and ecosystems. Here, it's hard to say if things are on balance good or bad, because if you have a change in an ecosystem structure or a species shift, you can imagine a predator moving into a new species area or a new range would be good for that predator, but might be bad for the prey that are in that region. So it's hard to call it good or bad. But what we do see is definite changes to the structure of ecosystems, to the species ranges, and to the seasonal timing or phenology of different ecosystems all around the world, both on land, in freshwater systems, and in ocean ecosystems. So if you'll advance the slide, you'll see that these changes in systems are connected in each case to the types of physical climate changes that we've also observed to shift. And here are examples of different climatic impact drivers that have been specifically attributed to human influence. So here we're taking it one step further, not just saying that this is connected to larger climate change, but these shifts in drought, in fire weather, in compound flooding, heavy rainfall, glaciers, sea level, ocean acidification, and heat extremes. Each of these, we can say not just that they've been increasing, but that we are seeing the direct signature of human influence in terms of our greenhouse gases and land use changes shifting each of these types of climate. Now, this also gets to the deeper issue, which is that in this larger set of reports, we are not just talking about average global change. We are connecting increasingly to more than 30 different categories of physical climate conditions that are changing. And this is vital as we're thinking about adaptation and different risk management techniques. We can't just think in general, we have to think about the specific vulnerabilities and risks that are attached to the things that we care about. So here, just as an example, again, you'll see dry extremes, wet extremes, heat extremes, coastal, ice, and open ocean changes. This is going across the entire climate system and is further evidence of the changes that are concerning. And if you'll advance the slide one more time, the bottom panel of SPM1 shows how these changes connect to the overall climate change signal, form a kind of roadmap, or at least a set of warning signs about the path that is to come. So here on the top part of this, you'll see the famous climate stripes that have been popularized by Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading. And each vertical stripe in this chart shows an annual temperature, so an annual global temperature change. And here we've connected it to the pre-industrial 1850 to 1900 levels. So when you're thinking about global warming levels and the 1.5 degrees targets, this is on that same scale. And you can see, going back to 1900, that a lot of the changes that have occurred in the last 120 or so years have been fairly small compared to the changes that might come in the next 80 years, from 2020 out to 2100. But here, of course, we can't make a prediction. We have to look across a variety of projected scenarios that encapsulate different types of greenhouse gas emissions and development scenarios. And we've classified these from very low up to very high, with the bottom two scenarios including substantial mitigation that aims for the 1.5 and 2 degrees targets. And then the upper three scenarios being various levels of continued development and fossil fueled development. And it's important to note that these continue to warm even beyond 2100 as we're going out to the future. But I think what's really captured the imagination of a lot of people who have seen this figure is the bottom set of icons. And what this does is takes what used to be a kind of clinical scientific graph and humanizes it and helps us understand that somebody who was born in 1950 has experienced a certain amount of climate change, especially in the last 30 or so years of their life when it's really taken off. But this experience is quite different than somebody who was born in 1980 and has seen kind of steady warming over the course of their lifetime. And neither of those generations are really fully understanding the challenge that is coming to those who have been born in 2020, as an example of more recent years. Those born in 2020 are looking at a future that is largely determined by the types of changes that we make as a society. And we all know these people. We know people in this older generation, in this middle generation, and in the new generations to come. And I think the conversations that people are having reflect that there are these different experiences. And sometimes we get trapped in our own experience and don't quite understand that there's a different future ahead, and that each of us are kind of experiencing climate change in our own way. Just a couple of things to note: the people who were born in 1950 have seen about 0.85 or so degrees Celsius warming over the course of their 70 years. People born in 1980 have experienced almost as much of that in just their 40 years. And people born in 2020, by the time they get out to 70 years old, will have experienced warming about 3 times as fast as that 1950s generation, if we're in that very high scenario. But the difference between that very high scenario and the very low scenario is larger than the entire amount of global warming that has occurred from pre-industrial conditions to today. It's about twice as much. So our choices going out into the future are going to determine the amount of climate change in a really dramatic way. So we're really proud of this figure. It's been featured just this last weekend as the climate graphic of the week. And we're already seeing people kind of coming up with their own versions of it and trying to understand how their own generation is experiencing and will experience climate of the future. So I think with that, back to you, Siri, and I really appreciate everybody's time today.
Great, thank you, Alex. And we're very privileged to have some of the key authors, and we've been working on these figures here, and we all worked on SPM 6, which I showed first together as well, and I'm really taken by the way that SPM 1 is communicating to the world, and how to set the figures together. If you look across, we can present all 7, but if you look from one figure to the next, they all tell a story. You can basically read the headline of each figure, and you can sort of read the story of climate change. So I'm going to open up for comments, but I want to give the word first to Ole Christian Kristian, Miljødirektoratet, who's the Norwegian IPCC focal point and also delegate to last week, before last week, as we were approving the synthesis report. So you would have seen Alex and Minal and Nick and myself on the podium explaining the science behind the statements and the science behind the figures, and you would have had Ole Christian ask us hard questions or give supportive comments on what you wanted to see or not see. So Ole Christian, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Siri, and yes, I can confirm that last week was intense, and of course we really appreciate all the efforts that has been done, especially from the authors, because when we ask questions, you have to work, and you have to stay there and listen to us when we ask these questions and comments. But of course, you have to do all the work in between when we are meeting next time. So we really understand that this is a great challenge. So thank you for inviting me, and it's a real honor being here to talk to you and to listen. I think it's very interesting to now hear how outreach and communication of this report is happening. And of course, the report was accepted with the kind of backdrop that it's a really, really important input to the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And of course, in that context, all outreach and communication of these messages is of key interest to many, of course. So what I will try to focus on today is some of the key messages that we in the Norwegian Environment Agency as IPCC focal point in Norway brought forward in our press release that was also released a week ago. So I will try to do this sort of point by point as we sort of digested on the key messages. So of course the impacts the world has seen and experienced so far is unfortunately only the beginning, and the severeness of impacts will depend very much on the choices made within this decade. Of course, 2030 is an important year, and we really need to get implementing all the solutions on this issue. So what we sort of picked up in all the material from the synthesis report, that there are very clearly like 3 gaps that will need to be closed, and they will need to be closed simultaneously, and action need to be accelerated. So I will go through those 3 gaps that we highlighted, and of course it's the emission gap. We see that the national determined contribution from the parties under the UNFCCC are by far not ambitious enough. And the current NDCs also need, of course, to be followed up with proper implementation and climate action. So solutions are available, but pace need to be picked up when it comes to the emission gap. The second gap is the adaptation gap that also have been mentioned today. So societies and nature need to be better prepared and made more robust to tackle already observed and further expected impact. And many adaptation options lose their effectiveness with increased warming. So this is also a part why we really need to accelerate all the adaptation options to close this gap. And third, but not least, there is a financial gap. So financial flows needs to be redirected there is enough global capital available, but both public and private finance flows for fossil fuel are still greater than those for climate action. And we also see that the challenges of closing this gap is largest in the global south or the developing countries. So that was more or less the three gaps that we sort of drove out of the report on a sort of overarching communication input in a way. Of course, it's also very important that the report says that there are solutions available. And however, the time for sort of picking and choosing about these options, that has gone in a way. The train has left the station. So we now have to do all we can everywhere to implement solutions for both mitigation and adaptation. And as I said earlier, this decade from now and up to 2030 is crucial. At the same time, it is very important that implementing these solutions should be done in an equitable way, and that the solution does not adversely affect other important issues such like biodiversity, food and water security, local livelihoods, and the right of indigenous people. And to the extent possible, we really need to play along with nature and shift away from unsustainable consumption and production. We have seen increasing demographic pressure and persistent unsustainable use and management of land, ocean, and water, and we have to shift away from this. And of course, all of this is easier said than done, but at least this is some of the key messages that we picked up and tried to sort of make the society aware of from our part. And of course, in the backdrop of this, climate change is probably the greatest challenge for humankind to be solved. So just at the end here, I just want to give a large shout out to the authors of the synthesis report. It could definitely not have been done without their dedication. And I also want to recognize the whole IPCC family. It's sort of ranging from my fellow delegates, other member countries, the authors, as I mentioned, the leadership of the IPCC, and also the secretariat. And there are always challenges in all these levels, but in the IPCC, collectively, there seems always to be enough champions to bring this vessel back to safe harbors. So thank you for listening. And yeah, if there are any questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you, Siri.
Well, thank you, Ole Christian, and thank you for being one of those champions. And indeed, we did need some champions to get the synthesis report through, and it was an amazing collective effort, which in the end was really 24 hours a day without stop. Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that important point with the linkages that you made to sustainable development, and the fact that many mitigation and adaptation options actually have the social benefits and the global economic benefits of implementing many of these options are larger than the costs, even if you don't take account of the avoided damages and losses. So many of these options are good anyway for economic and social and ecological development. So that's a very important point. It's actually about shifting development in better directions in so many dimensions. What I would like to do now is just open the floor to questions, comments, and I'll try to distribute the answers between the IPCC authors who are here, or for the Christian, if you may also have responses to some of them. And I'll try to keep an eye both on the screen and the people in the room. Been about 40 people on Zoom, and we're, I guess, around 30 or so in the room. So, so yes, and please introduce yourself by name if you can.
Arjen Wals, Wageningen University and NMBU Sustainability Center. Very impressive how you have been able to make such a succinct, clear summary of something that is hugely complex. I really am impressed, especially that last figure showing the different generations, how they are being affected. I think is very powerful because it communicates very well. That brings me to my question. I see a fourth gap, and you probably also have it in the report, which is what I would call the knowledge, understanding, and action gap. I think communicating climate change, climate psychology, climate education, and establishing this climate literacy is probably critical if we are going to create enough support in society for all the mitigation and adaptation measures that need to be taken. I thought it was missing in the mitigation aspect, developing a citizenry that is more climate aware, climate empowered, and more literate in dealing with climate change. If we don't work on that, then we may end up having a kind of eco-totalitarian regime as the window for participation, democracy, education is declining. We may end up having to resort to kind of a form of totalitarianism to change behavior. And that concerns me because that would not be sustainable either. So why, maybe to be provocative, why is this education capacity building competence development component somewhat missing, or maybe I'm just not seeing it?
Okay, I can make a start, and I don't know, Minal, whether you also want to speak specifically to big SPM point 7 afterwards. But so I would say though that it is actually reflected. I mean, you raised a really important point because totalitarianism will not be consistent with sustainability in any way. So there are a few things that what we bring on play out, and one of them is that a critical enabler of climate resilient development and shifting development pathways towards sustainability is diverse knowledges and values. And of course, that heading also fits a lot of different things, but it's an increasing recognition that a narrow set of knowledges needs to be expanded, including indigenous knowledge, including practical knowledge, and understanding, a deeper understanding of what climate change means and how one can act on climate change. And very closely linked to that is the issue of inclusive governance. So inclusive governance draws on diverse knowledges. And a robust finding as well from the report is how a lack of economic, institutional, and capacity is a barrier to climate resilient development. So it also speaks to capacity. So as Nick was saying, the issue of equity is, totally central to, as an enabler. It's a key enabler that, permeates all the enablers really of climate change action. But Minal, if you're still there, would you be ready to speak about how this is picked up in working group 3? I was thinking perhaps around the issue of behavioral change and the institutional structures around behavioral change.
Yes, thank you, Siri. I appreciate the question very much. It's a relevant fourth gap, and we agree. I don't think the synthesis report does full justice to this. And so therefore, I would admit that this is a gap that we haven't addressed fully. But I'd just like to point that we had this struggle in the Working Group 3 report about behavioral change, and that in an earlier draft, we said that people can change behaviors and it will make a big difference. And then somebody said, no, people cannot change behaviors by themselves because they need to be told what is sustainable, what is not. They need to be given these choices in a more informed way. And therefore, we sort of vaguely refer to how choices are presented to consumers as a way to facilitate behavioral change. But we don't really get into climate literacy that much on Working Group 3. But just speaking as a personal researcher who's done some outreach since our Working Group 3 report and now speaking to audiences, it's both an issue of communicating the science in a simple, digestible way, but it's also addressing the miscommunication around these messages and how this whole narrative about we need coal, we need fossil fuels because they they give jobs. And therefore the struggle as a scientist is always on how best to communicate for action. And the final point I'd like to make here is that as a scientist, I mean, we've delivered a report, and I also feel that it is up to other stakeholders to take it, maybe through translations, through more regional messaging, through outreach. And therefore events like this do really, because IPCC reports are in a way inaccessible for the general public, and therefore I'd be keen to hear insights on how do we close the gap really. But that was a short answer to your question. I hope I did answer it in some way. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see Nick Simpson's also got his hand up. So please go ahead, Nick.
Thanks, Siri. Yeah, so this is something that we addressed in Working Group 2, but in the synthesis report, it just has one line, unfortunately, because yeah, the synthesis report is very tight on space. But I agree with you. This is really the nub of what do we know about climate change and how does it affect significant transformational change? We, in chapter 9 of Working Group 2, recognize the inequality globally between those areas that have higher rates of climate change literacy and those that have lower rates. For example, across Africa, average national climate change literacy rates are only 37%, with many rural areas less than 5% of the population with an understanding, a minimal understanding of human-caused climate change, let alone an understanding of the immediate and future risks of climate change to their livelihood. And so you got entire geographies of population that are experiencing climate change and understanding it in light of their historical experiences rather than the heightened risk that comes from climate change. But what we couldn't find was a strong connection between how improved climate literacy empirically links to improved adaptation outcomes across Africa, at least. And for us, I think that's quite a new and exciting research agenda to link how exactly improved understanding of climate change relates to better responses, because there's also a lot of social science out there that indicates a declining remarkability of extreme events from climate change, for example, that don't necessarily lead to risk reduction measures in households or in policy responses. But I would agree that climate literacy is the fertile soil for improved climate services and improved climate data and early warning systems. So progress is needed on all those fronts in order to turn science into action.
What I was saying earlier, a robust finding about how action takes place through interaction between government, civil society, and the private sector, and which universities are part of these actors and important actors within this landscape. I just wanted to add on what you said, Nick, about climate literacy. I mean, climate literacy can be different things in different contexts, and I think we also have to pay attention to the unequal distribution of consumption and the finding that there are many options available for reducing emission-intensive consumption while improving societal well-being. And that is perhaps here in Norway one of the key challenges that we have, is the fact that we need to identify and implement those options that reduce emissions through a change in consumption. And that is also a very important part of climate literacy. Yes, we've got our replica, Rice. Yes, please speak up so we can hear your question and I'll repeat it.
Thanks very much. Thanks for this super interesting presentation and not least of all for the work that's behind it. My question is this. Do you perceive this, those of you who have worked on the report, do you perceive this as asking us to think less about the long and midterm and more about the short term? And if so, what does that mean for us at universities?
Okay, you're asking us whether we need to think less about the long and short term and more about, long and medium term and more about the short term in terms of action?
Yeah.
Okay, my initial response would be we absolutely have to think about action now, but we have to think about also how those actions play out in the long term. So that's one of the findings, the integration across timescales and governance levels and systems, right? So we do have to think about which options can be put in place now and make a difference now in the context of a set of options and set of policies in the longer term. Alex has got his hand up, so please go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Siri. It's a great question, and of course, our answer is going to be we need to think about all scales. That's always kind of the scientist answer, I think. But you know what I think we're really pushing in this report is this idea that climate change is not some distant future problem. It's not a challenge that evolves slowly. It's something that is happening right now, and we are at a kind of critical inflection point in terms of the decisions that we make right now are really going to not just set the emissions in a very, very rapidly narrowing carbon budget, but are also going to set the enabling conditions, the overall balance of enabling conditions to allow climate action to proceed or to hinder climate action. And in that sense, you know, what we do today, both our actions and our inaction, are really having outsized consequences for the long term. So I would say that if you look at the format of this report, we very clearly say, you know, here's the observed change, that's section A. Here's the long-term challenge, that's section B. But now let's get to business. What do we need to do in the near term to put us on a better path? And I think a lot of the graphics, a lot of the kind of perspective is to show that we do have options and that these options will matter not just for current generations, but for future generations. And even, you know, with irreversible and kind of slow response systems, you know, thousands of years of influence. So it really is meant to be an empowering, you know, sense of agency here that this is not something way off in the future. This is a chance right now to set us on a better pathway. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, actually, so one of the key findings is that it's not just mitigation that must take place fast, but the fact that we already have impacts means we need to act quickly when it comes to adaptation. And also in terms of lock-in. So that's another thing that the actions that we make this decade are locking us into development pathways, into stranded assets, into particular forms of infrastructure. So that's also a reason why action now is important for the long term. But I'll give the word to Ole Christian. You have your hand up.
No, thank you, Siri. Just to quickly react upon that, and I think the question is very good, and I think the sort of urgency messages in this report, it's mostly to get more climate action happening in this decade. But of course, the solutions that are presented and the decisions that are made, they are meant to stay on forever in a way. So for instance, we need deep, rapid and sustained emission reductions. We need to accelerate adaptation solutions in this decade because the impacts are getting closer and closer and more severe, of course, as temperature is rising. So in my view, it's mostly that we need decisions that brings us to solving the issue, while all the knowledge we have already is sort of enough to start acting in a way. I'm not sure if that made sense, but it was meant to make sense at least. Thanks.
Thank you. That certainly did make sense. I'm conscious of time, actually, that we've already run over by 10 minutes, but I'll ask for your flexibility to maybe stay on for another 5 minutes. If anyone has more questions, then we'll. Yes, John McNeish.
Hi, my name is John McNeish. I'm here at the University of Life Sciences. My question, I guess the question that a lot of the public would also pose, and that is, well, you're the now, you know, there are options here. You're the specialists. How optimistic are you There are options, but how optimistic are you about actually the right course being taken here? Given if we look across the planet right now, at the circumstances that we live in right now, both locally, nationally, internationally, how optimistic are you as authors of this report that the right course will be taken?
Okay, thank you. I was about to say we are in your hands. We're in the hands of civil society, you and me, of governments and of private sector in terms of taking these actions. So what's important about the IPCC report is that it gives the scientific evidence of how to act, but it's not prescriptive. So it is really up to decision makers, such as the international negotiations, the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention. So this report provides the scientific evidence that's taken into the climate change negotiations at the international level. So that's why the report is so important and why it takes a week to get it through, because those messages need to be balanced and crystal clear. It's also the basis for national policymaking and often at the local level as well, because the messages carry a lot of legitimacy, but how they're translated into practice is very contextual. Does any one of my co-authors also want to speak to this question? I mean, it is a major effort, but I think the fact that we know more and more about the options that exist, and we know more about the fact that these options have co-benefits in terms of sustainability, in terms of social development, and so on, that gives us a huge opportunity right now. We're saying there's a closing window of opportunity if we don't act, but we have that window of opportunity to engage in these actions. Nick, would you like to speak to this?
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question, and I think if I was being brutally honest, I think a lot of us IPCC authors are almost pathologically optimists, because we have given so much of our heart and time to this process, believing that this is the strongest science policy interface that we can be involved in to secure a livable future for our children. And from a personal perspective, I've got two little kids. One's 2 years old, the other's 5 years old. They are in that generation, the alpha generation, that are going to live right up till the end of the century. And so I am optimistic that if we do the best science and we communicate it as well as we possibly can, we are giving ourselves the best chance to respond to climate change. That's why we're part of this process. That's why we volunteer our time unpaid to be in this thing. We can't be responsible for a lack of policy response. We have provided the science, and that's where our conscience ends on this case. Yeah, and I hope that's palatable. Yeah.
Thank you. And I see that it is really time to round up, and I believe we might also soon be kicked out of this room, but I'd like to thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to thank everyone who's been on Zoom listening in. I hope we can still continue the conversation various means, and a special thank you to my co-presenters. Minal, it's been great to see you again. Alex, Nick, and Ole Christian, thank you for also providing inputs, and yes, we're all part of the same family, as you put it. And to round off, I would like to invite our Vice Rector for Sustainability, Professor Afspeetsen, to say a few words.
Thank you, Siri. I just wanted to thank you for putting together this nice event, and for all of you who attended and used your time to come and present for us. It was really interesting. And I think for it really challenges us, because it's 10 years, that's what you say. We have 10 years, and the change and the decisions we make in the coming 10 years will
This
mean?
decade.
Huh?
This decade, that's.
This
what we're trying to
decade.
say.
So it's
7 years. 7 years. 7 years. The decisions we make in the next 7 years will really mean the future of 1,000 years.
Thousands of years.
Thousands of years.
Yeah.
It's hard to take in, actually. But if you take it in, it really means that we have to do so. We can't continue doing the same things that we've been doing for the last 100 years. We have to do new things. And I think we all have to see the possibility we have as individuals to make these changes. Me as a vice rector, you all as students and lecturers and everything. And I think we now created this sustainability hub here at this university to open up for initiatives like this. So when people have something, good ideas, it doesn't have to be participating in IPCC. It can be smaller things or bigger things, but I think it would be really good. And I invite everybody to come and present good ideas for change. Yeah, we need to do that. So thanks for coming. Yeah.